Hello and welcome to SpectatorTV. I'm James Hill and I'm joined today by Fraser Nelson and Katie Balls. Now, it's been a big night from the local elections across England and Wales, and we've got half the results now. We're recording just after lunchtime on Friday afternoon. Katie, what do you think the big stories of this election are so far?
So I think the results started pretty bad for the Tories, and you can't get away from that. If you look at some of the councils that they've lost control of, if you look at some of the areas where Labour has taken control, such as Redditch, I think that, when you speak to MPs, I do think this is towards the bottom end of expectations on councils. You add to that, however, what's just happened around lunchtime on Friday, which is Ben Houchen being re-elected as Tees Valley Mayor. And I think you can say that Rishi Sunak, at the very least, has avoided the nuclear option. The nuclear option was that he would lose, all the metro mayors and have bad local council results. And I think Ben Houchen has been seen to be such a symbol of the Red Wall, seen as the patron saint of the Red Wall, had a mandate of over 70% when he was re-elected in 2021, that it would have become very symbolic were he to lose. So I think Rishi Sunak has bought himself a little bit of breathing space. He's now got this, along with, I think, Harlow and the fact that did not go to Labour control despite efforts to say, we're not done yet. But of course, scratch the surface, and most MPs do not think the metro mayors say how they're going to fare in a general election. They think the council results are closer to that, and they are much more negative.
Fraser, what are the trends you've noticed so far, given the results about halfway through now?
That this isn't quite as bad as the Tories feared. This morning we woke up towards catastrophe for the Tories. You had John Curtis who was saying this is every bit as bad. They're losing 1 in every 2 councillors that they're standing up. But since then we saw things that made Keir Starmer a little bit disappointed. Of course he would have liked Harlow. He went there with Sky News and he was taking it as an emblem, in his words, of the sort of place Labour needs to win if it's going to show progress. Well, that progress didn't arrive in the way that he thought. So it's quite something for him to have gone there, fingered it as a target, and a target which he failed to hit. We've also seen Labour lose control of Oldham Council, which I think is quite significant, something that you've written about, James, that we're seeing a backlash in the northwest from predominantly Muslim voters about Starmer's position on Gaza. Now, right at the outbreak of hostilities, you had something like 250 Labour councillors wrote to Starmer demanding he changed his position. He didn't, to his great merits. He stayed firm. But since then, you've had lots of defections. The big question, is this going to actually hurt him? Muslims are the group of voters most likely to vote Labour, more so than anybody else. So if they were less likely to do so, then would that really affect Labour at the ballot box? We've seen, to be honest, it's no more than a few dozen wards so far. I don't think it'll be tomorrow, I think, when we get the rest of the results in the northwest. But so we can start to see a little bit of pressure on Labour, and not quite to a sweeping victory they wanted. But still, it goes without saying, this is the worst day for Tories for a generation.
And Katie, let's put this in a bit of perspective. What does this mean when we compare it to previous elections, perhaps since 1997? Are the Tories on course to lose a lot of seats at the next election?
I mean, they are on course to lose a lot of seats in the next election, but I think we probably knew that before these local election results. Speaking to various strategists about the results this morning, I mean, what I heard back was, it just shows the polls are correct. I think it's showing the fact that you are getting these general election polls suggesting a horrific defeat for the Tories. There's nothing really today to suggest that that's not going to happen. However, John Curtis, looking at those results, has said that Labour is not making the type of swings that you had Tony Blair make just before 1997, which, again, to Fraser's point, I think Labour are having a good showing in these local election results. They're hitting lots of the bellwether seats, not all of them, but enough of them, to be able to say that they are on course for a majority. But we are not, I think, at the point to John Curtis's argument where, they're hitting every single one and it looks like this huge landslide is coming. And just some, I think, doubts such as, what's happening with the Muslim vote means that it's not this clean sweep for Labour. And Tees Valley, if we go back, it was very ambitious for Labour to try and take that one. But they have been pouring resources into it. Keir Starmer has gone multiple times to the area. And then you look at the West Midlands. Now, we won't get the West Midlands until tomorrow, but I think it's interesting, to Fraser's point, that you already have some Labour sources coming out from the West Midlands area saying that they don't think that Labour is going to clinch it from Andy Street. That was always the much more doable one for Labour, given Andy Street had a lower margin of victory in 2021, but they're blaming this on Israel-Palestine. They're blaming it on the fact that there's a George Galloway endorsed independent candidate that they think will, if they lose, will be the reason that Labour doesn't get it. So I think that does show you, in a general election, how does this translate? There aren't, in truth, that many seats where probably this would stop potentially re-election, but there are some. We'll see what happens in Bristol later in terms of the Greens trying to make those inroads. That's where Thangham Debonair, the Shadow Culture Secretary, sits. But even Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, his seat is one where he's had to be, a bit of a backlash over the Israel-Palestine situation. So I think this is uncomfortable for them. It's not to say the Tories are having a good time, they're having a horrific night. The question is really, given we've said it's very priced in, the Tories have a bad night, is there anything to suggest the Tories are having an even worse night than MPs expected? Because that's when Rishi Sunak might start to look in danger. And therefore, is there anything to suggest that Labour's victory parade is less so? And I think right now, it's bad for Rishi Sunak, but he's got a few things to point to. Keir Starmer is looking good, but it's not a full victory parade.
We've discussed the locals, discussed the mayorals, and of course there was a parliamentary by-election today, Fraser, in Blackpool South. And Rishi Sunak, as Katie says there, can point to the fact that the Tories did come second, but they only just beat Reform by only 120 votes. We've got a bit of discussion on Coffee House on the blog right now. One column saying that Reform are a busted flush without Nigel Farage. Another suggesting by Patrick Flynn perhaps that the Reform have had a good night. Where do you sit on this whole debate? How well have Reform done tonight?
But the big question for Reform is that we know they've got about 15% in the opinion polls. Tories have got about 23%. Now, how real is that for a party which doesn't really have an apparatus? We don't really have campaigners to go door knocking, etc. So might it be that Reform is the party that does well in the polls, but when it comes to election, always falls short? Now, they're only contesting, I think, 1 in 6 seats that they could contest, but it does seem that where they stood, they are getting about 15% that they get in the national polls. Now, that's bad news for the Conservatives because it suggests that they are actually able to convert that opinion poll rating into real votes. Not huge, 15% is quite small, but those are 15% that would probably otherwise be going to the Conservatives. So this dashes the hope that in the general election, the Reform vote might melt away into nothing. And a lot of Tories had rather been hoping this. Now, again, we haven't seen, we're talking when just half of the councils are decided, so it might not be as strong as that in the end. But had a few dozen people voted the other way, the Tories would have been third in Blackpool, forced into third place by Richard Tice's Reform. That would have been a calamity. And the funny thing about politics is we tend to talk about it in binary terms. Yes, they came second. Yes, they've saved face. But they only came second by the narrowest of margins. So I think the Reform stands as a more potent threat, I think, as a result of what we've seen so far in the results, at least.
Yeah, and I think it is the case that if you look at that Reform vote, I think there are signs of relief in CCHQ because effectively they managed to avoid the headlines of the Tories came third. But of course, it wasn't by very much. And speaking privately to ministers, they're quite freaked out by how close Reform came. Now, I think that in a general election, they'd say, well, this might be the by-election effect, but it does at the very least suggest that lots of these marginal seats, the Reform Party could easily shave off 500 to 1,000 votes. That's going to matter a lot in those. So I think there will be anxiety. I think that ahead of these results, there's a question about would Rishi Sunak make it through? And, it's always been seen as a big danger point for Rishi Sunak. I think for him to be in the true danger zone, it was, ahead of it, the sense was you'd have to have the Tories come third in the Blackpool by-election behind Reform, and Ben Houchen would have to lose, and maybe Andy Street too. Now, those things at the moment, we'll see on Andy Street, have not come to pass, but I still think we're not completely out of the woods yet, just in the sense of speaking to MPs. The thing that I'm getting more is just there is quite a lot of silence right now because the results are only part of the way through. And therefore, lots of people want to wait till all the results are out before they start to, decide what they have to say, whether it's about Rishi Sunak's future, perhaps more likely about the strategy and what they want to see on from Downing Street in future to keep their support alive.
Thanks again for watching Spectator TV. And as Katie says, you can keep up to date with all our coverage on Coffee House Online, and we will bring all the results as they come.